let's discuss adjustable gastric bands. There currently are 2 gastric bands that are available on the market, although I believe the Realize band has recently been discontinued. So we may be down to just one, which is the lap band. Now, if you look at the history of the lap band, it's been owned by, I think, 4 or 5 different companies who've kind of sold it off one by one. And that alone should raise some red flags. If it was such a useful device and so safe and offered all of the benefits that we once thought the gastric band could, then once a company owned it, they would continue to grow and prosper and would not be interested in dumping it on another company and for a change in their business strategy. So let's talk about adjustable gastric bands in 2018, which is the time I'm making this video. If we go back 10 years to around 2008, 2010, it was incredibly popular. And I remember walking into the exhibit hall at our national convention for bariatric surgery, and all the manufacturers of the different staplers and the vitamins, and pretty much anybody in the bariatric surgery industry has a booth, and they're offering information and the ability to taste the vitamins and see the new instruments that they've got. And when I walked in, I think it was 2007, 2008, the company that owned the lap band at the time, Allergan, had a 2-story booth. Their booth was so complicated, so expensive, they had actually built a 2nd story. I've never seen this at another conference since. But they had a 2-story booth. They were making a tremendous amount of money and pushing such a huge marketing push to get surgeons to put these bands in. And now that we look back on what's happened and the long-term complications that we're seeing, I really look at that as a dark spot in the history of what I really believe is otherwise a fantastic field of bariatric surgery, where we let the companies in the industry convince us of a procedure and the safety and efficacy of a procedure that really didn't pan out. And we probably had some information earlier than we changed our behaviors. But thankfully, around 10 years ago, we really just stopped putting in these gastric bands. And at this point, 95% of all surgeons don't offer gastric band as a procedure choice. I am certainly in that 95%, and I would never recommend it for a patient. So the reason why not is not the initial surgery. The initial surgery is very safe and straightforward and really has an incredibly low complication rate. It takes 30, 45 minutes and can be done, without too much difficulty, and patients can almost go home the same day. Occasionally they would stay overnight. But the problem is what happens down the road. I really see gastric band patients kind of falling into one of 3 categories. The first category is no weight loss at all. What we typically see is when we put patients on the progressive diet after surgery, where they move from from liquids to softer foods to foods with a little more substance, that diet is pretty restrictive, and we would see sometimes 10 to 20 pounds of weight loss. And then the patients would turn around and within 6 months have regained that weight and never really lost a pound. A third lost somewhere between 50 to 60 pounds before they started to gain the weight, and actually probably less than a third. This to me would probably be about 80% or even higher. Then the last third really lost a ton of weight. But then down the road, they started having some problems. But this was absolutely the minority patient who was successful with the gastric band. I think about 1 in 5 seems right. It may even be less than that. And what happened is as you tighten the band up, the patients inevitably developed chronic severe heartburn to the point where they couldn't sleep flat. They had to sleep propped up on pillows. Vomiting became something they did daily. And this to me is something that is very frustrating, because oftentimes patients look at these surgeries, bariatric surgeries, as something that essentially punishes you into vomiting or not being able to eat. rather than recognizing that they work in a very different way. And vomiting and chronic heartburn and other negative side effects should not have any part in your life after weight loss surgery, after any of the procedures. And if they do, then you need to seek attention from a bariatric surgeon and correct that. Don't allow yourself to continue to suffer from these symptoms, thinking that it's just how the surgery works, and that because of your obesity, you almost deserve to have these symptoms, because you can't be trusted to control your appetite on your own, so you have to be punished into a better diet. That is a completely nonsensical approach to this surgery, and one, if it's even in the back of your mind, I suggest you completely eliminate. These surgeries should allow you to eat comfortably for the rest of your life and should not be associated with vomiting and chronic heartburn. If it is, then there's either something wrong with the way you're eating or something wrong with your surgery, and it's time to go and seek treatment and make sure that you figure out a way to avoid this. So as we talked about, the gastric band also has poor weight loss, and really without question, the weight regain was inevitable. And even those patients who lost a lot of weight, we started to see it come back on within about 3-4 years after surgery. The patients who lost 50 to 60 pounds would typically regain it all and then some by year 5 or 6. And as I mentioned, it was completely ineffective in about 1/3 of all the patients. So if you have already had a gastric band placed, what do? What's your plan of attack? And I still see a lot of these patients. At this point, I think we've passed the point of maximal removal of the bands, where most of the patients who've had a lap band placed in the past have had it removed. But there still are a lot of people out there, and I still do see them in my office, but I definitely have noticed in the last year or so that the frequency is decreasing. So the first thing when I work with a patient who already has a gastric band in is we go over what their side effects. Do you have heartburn? Do you have vomiting? And one of the most important questions I ask them is, what does your family think about the gastric band? And this really gets back to this idea that you as the patient oftentimes have been either told or believe that you should be punished and you should vomit, and that's how this surgery is going to work. So you just kind of assume that that's how life is and how it should be in order for you to control your weight. And so it doesn't bother you as much as it bothers your family, and your spouse or your children may become very upset that every time they go out for dinner, every time you sit down for a family meal, you have to get up after 10 or 20 minutes and vomit up the food that you've just eaten. That just really isn't a normal thing to do, and it oftentimes bothers your family much more than it bothers you. So that's one of the most important questions, and I can't tell you how many times I've been talking with a patient and they'll say, well, you know, it's not so bad. I work with it. I live with it. I can control it. It's all right. And I say, well, what does your husband think about it? What do your kids think about it? Oh, they hate it. They can't stand it. They want me to get this thing out. And when we see that difference in opinion, where your family members who love you and care for you and support you want you to get this thing out, and you are still kind of convincing yourself that this is how you're going to maintain your weight, that has to be addressed. When I work with patients who have a lap band, and really at this point it's anyone who's had a lap band, I think we have to discuss the fact that ultimately it is going to need to be removed. And what really we should direct our attention toward is, when should we remove it? And there's a lot of factors that go into that discussion, specifically whether or not you've had substantial weight loss, because we know when you remove the band, the weight that you've lost from it will come back. And it, again, is a little tricky. If you're 30 pounds down from your highest weight, but you're vomiting all the time, well, that's not real weight loss. That's weight loss from being sick. And no matter what, we have to keep you from being sick. You can't live your life like that. So that is not real weight loss. If you're 100 pounds down and aren't vomiting and don't have severe heartburn, that really is a very different situation. And how we address each of these two patients, it differs significantly. And we'll discuss this a little bit in some other videos on revision. So I think when I work with patients, number one, I want to see where are they on their weight loss. Have they not lost much weight? If they haven't, get the thing out. It's not doing anything and it's just causing problems. If they've lost a lot of weight, then we have to talk about what else we can do. Also, your desire for another procedure. If you haven't lost a lot of weight and the band's not doing anything, but you do want to lose a lot of weight, you still have a substantial amount of weight to lose, and you are interested in another weight loss surgery, like either a gastric bypass or a sleeve, well, then we talk about revision. And then there's some difference in opinions between surgeons about whether you should take it out first and then come back and do the second procedure in 3 months or 6 months or a year, or if you should just do it all at the same time. My preference 95% of the time is to do it all at the same time, to remove the band and do the primary surgery at the same time. I think if anything, it's a little safer than the 2 surgeries individually if you add up the risks, and it's also much, much easier for the patients in terms of time off and cost and all the other factors that go into the decision to have surgery. And then finally, if we are going to do a revision, should we have a gastric bypass or sleeve gastrectomy as the revisional procedure? And again, there's some pros and cons to that, but oftentimes you can use the same decision-making factor as a primary patient if you're has in terms of whether they should have a gastric bypass or a sleeve gastrectomy.